Well, I don't know if I expected to be recording so much today, but the keynote was a banger, and the Remaster Project panel was just as big. It was Jason Bullman, James Case, Michael Sayer, and Logan Bonner came on and gave us a lot more details about what is coming up in the remaster and what we can expect. And we're going to go ahead and cover it. So, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and talk about it. So this particular panel started out with information that we already kind of knew. There's a set of 4 new books. 2 are coming out in November, the Player Core and the GM Core, as well as the Monsters and the Player Core 2 in 2024. And why are they doing it? Well, they're switching from the OGL to the ORC license, and it cleans things up, changes the language a little bit, and refresh the books, and kind of reorganizes things. It presents a player book that was easier to grasp, to understand, without having the big GM section in the middle of it, in addition to the game mastery guide. And it joined the GM sections together into one book, so it's kind of easier to do. It removed barriers to entry and streamlined things to make the game work faster. Very minor tweaks to a few things, and it trimmed out things that weren't doing the work. This will come up a few times in this particular summary as far as trimming out things that weren't doing the work, but it does make things better that did not work as they were intended to. Now, once again, they showed the retailer covers, the sketch covers that we've seen before. None of the books are at the printers yet, so there are no interior shots, but let's go ahead and start with Player Core 1. So with Player Core 1, we kind of started with Logan with the alignment. It's the hot button issue for decades at various tables and various chat rooms as to what they mean, how you apply them, and everybody kind of had a different view, and it was also from the OGL. So they decided to let it go and come up with something cooler and newer ways for character creation, and that came up with the edicts and anathema, which was already part of the system. It is what you believe, what you're inclined to do, and what you refuse to do. There are certain classes that have to adhere to the strictest form of these, but as we saw in the Dwarven kind of first look that we saw, when they say popular edicts and popular anathemas, those are popular but not absolute. So basically what we're doing is holy and unholy, and no longer doing the chaos and law part of it. So they perused the books, and good and evil came up a lot, but law and chaos didn't. In other words, the lawful and chaotic didn't matter so much as the good and evil, aside from a few mechanics when alongside good and evil. So they mechanically removed the law and chaos because it didn't really affect much. So what happens to the planes? Well, nothing really changes there. The alignments, in their words, it was a really good example. The alignments are like writing prompts, but they weren't necessarily defined by law or chaos. It didn't change the story, and it removed a mechanical piece that really, going back to that phrase I said before, it just didn't do the work. Now, there are some details on holy and unholy. Clerics, as a class, can sanctify themselves to their deity. Some deities don't care about sanctification, but if you do sanctify, you get the holy or unholy trait and get that holy and holy damage assigned to certain spells if you're sanctified. And this will come up when we talk about spirit power, which is what we're going to do now. Then we came up with spirit damage, which is a new damage type. Spirit damage blasts the spirit of the creature directly. So one way you can think about it is you have a ghost. They're physically not there, so physical damage might not affect them, but spirit damage will, because their spirit is obviously represented. Spirit damage can be sanctified, holy or unholy, which is why the sanctification to your deity might be important. Only certain spells, though, will allow this sanctified damage to be tacked on. Ancestries, they added 2 more, Leshy and Orc. They have been promoted to Player Core 1. Orcs are already in organized play, and they wanted to move it to a common ancestry, and the core feats are just a brush up of what was already there in organized play. It's been kind of scattered around between half orcs and the human heritages in the APG. So now it is all just under one umbrella in the orc section. Versatile heritages have introduced mixed ancestries. So in the past, you could play a half elf or a half orc, while you can now do half orc, half dwarf. Rules exist, and they are not all under humans anymore, but they are in their own mixed ancestry grouping. These rules explain how to explore these mixed ancestries and how to bring them into your campaigns. It is a new framework, and it pulls them all out of human, the Luveran elf or the Drumar orc, and it allows you to express how you want to present yourself to the world and to the game system, and it removes some of the barriers. Now, Aasimar and Tiefling needed to go with OGL, but they needed something to represent mortal ancestry that has ties to extraplanar or angelic or demonic forces, and that has been changed to the Nephilim. Has a lot of content of the Aasimar and Tiefling. You can both be angelic and demonic and have blood of both in you. Brings in animalistic features, bring these things together so you can now play these types of characters. And they also brought in changelings into the player core, which are children of hags. Changelings and Leshy have thematic underpinnings, and this is centered on kind of nature and the natural aspect. And this is part of Core 1, so that is why these are brought into Core 1. Now let's go ahead and move on to classes. They told us why they put certain classes in the core rulebook. And the first ones we'll talk about are the 4 spell categories. So you have the Bard, the Cleric, the Druid, and the Wizard, and each one of those represents a spell class, as well as the Fighter, the Rogue, the Ranger, and the Witch. So let's talk about what changes for each one of the classes. They started out with Bard. It is from the occult school. It's pretty close to how it wanted to play. There are some more role-playing hooks that have been added to it because it was kind of bare before and you had to do all the work kind of yourself. So there's more detail in the muses. As far as the mechanics, there's only minor changes. They're trying to boost up their flavor and make it easier to get in the headspace of a bard. One of the big changes they had, which I like very much because I do play a bard in one of my campaigns, is that they now have access to all martial weapons. Next, we'll move on to Cleric. Cleric had a significant brush up with the alignment changes and now the sanctification process. One of the big changes they made, and they talked extensively about this, was the War Priest. It was divisive. There were things you could do with a cloistered cleric that would translate into a sort of War Priest, but War Priest couldn't do the same back the other way. And that was a big perception issue that they had, that you could spend resources to get what the War Priest had. With the War Priest Final Doctrine, they get master proficiency with its weapon and master training in all martial weapons. There are new feats, tweaked spice in some feats. War Priest armor feat goes all the way up to heavy armor, and it scales throughout the levels. As far as Cloistered Cleric, there's more flavor to bring it out of the class. Now, as far as feats, they basically try to make them more satisfying to the War Priest if it wants to get into melee combat and give them new tools. And then they moved on to Druid. Druid is a class that most people enjoy to play. It was not as many core changes that were needed to be made here, just more nature flavoring. The Druidic language is now called the Wild Song, and it sounds like animals. Some of the orders got options and some didn't. So now all of these orders now have cool new things that they can do. Custom spell shaping abilities. For example, they brought out the Storm Order that can create thunderclaps. The Leaf Order with the Leshy Familiar has some abilities to give you low-level resistance to certain damage because your skin is as hard as bark. It's kind of like more of a tune-up and giving more options and changed around without really retooling. Fighter, not too many changes at all. They kind of stressed how you could bring a fighter from the core rule book and bring it into player core and really not have to adjust much, if anything at all. They removed an entire trait. That's the open trait. The open trait was not very intuitive. It wasn't very necessary. And mechanically, they were saying it just didn't do the work. So it was stricken out of player core. And although Fighter was largely doing its job well, they did kind of do a little spoiler on something here, which it benefited from new actions. And one of them they said was a reposition action. and some things you can do with your athletic skill without going into very much detail, but it was mainly just curation and a cleanup. Ranger, all of the Warden spells are out of the APG and put into the core. Automatically increase your DC with those particular things. Polish the feat's accessibility. Crossbow feat, there was no proper martial crossbow, so they reworded the crossbow archetype feat and how it progressed. There's an arbalesque, which is a two-handed crossbow with a one-action reload. They basically moved the spells to the core book and made sure that they can scale and progress as you move through. There were also some feats that other classes got that Rangers got, but they needed hunt prey, so they kind of got rid of that in a lot of cases and made them much more flexible. Rogue, kind of like the fighter, didn't get a lot of changes. They took the greatest stuff from the APG and brought it into the core, so now it's all together. Rogues are now trained in all martial weapons, and rackets incentivize you to use certain weapons, but all are available. One of the things they said is, and kind of like the light bulb moment for this, was Treasure Vault dropped, but after a few weeks when people started realizing there's so much cool roguey stuff in it, but rogues can't use it. You would have to archetype in order to use these things that look pretty vital to a rogue. So you can now sneak attack with agile and finesse weapons now. And Ruffian has got some additions as well with martial weapons. And they kind of did a little spoiler here with now there's a step after feint with Scoundrel. So that'll be interesting. Then the big two, which were Witch and Wizard. Witch has been moved to the core. It's an iconic concept. So right now the class is difficult to do and do well, and it's convoluted for flavor. It's kind of a little bit generic, so that had a larger rework. They basically dialed the witch flavor all the way up. It kind of gives space for the patrons to be more specific, but more mysterious. And they gave some examples, so don't lose me there. Basically, as opposed to the cursed patron is now called the Resentment. It is basically a slightly weaker version of a deity. The winter patron is now called the Silence of the Snow. The patrons are more present. It kind of takes the restraints off familiars because the familiars weren't unique to witches. In other words, a familiar that you pick up with familiar mastery was the same as a witch familiar. Now all familiars get some cool abilities from their patron. For example, the freezing rhyme from the Silence of the Snow. And there is a focus spell called Patron's Puppet where you can have the patron move the familiar as a free action. It basically allows the patron to focus more on the player without doing everything for the player, because if that's the case, well, why doesn't the patron just do it themselves? Something that didn't change, 1 hex per turn is still there, but they are taking some of the restraints off the hexes. Didn't get into that very much. Clean up some feats. Eldritch Nail and Hair feats are combined. And then they kind of teased one, which was you can turn a broom or a polearm into a flying broom. And one kind of cool higher level feat where the patron can reach an arm out of the familiar and grab the opponent's soul. Apparently it's the highest patron feat you could get, but it sounds super interesting. The last one they talked about is the Wizard. The Wizard, a legacy from OGL. And one of the things that they really wanted to change was spell schools. So spells having a school is going away. However, illusions, because of their particular class, are still going to be classified as illusion. That's the only one that's really kind of still going to have that particular trait, but most others are going away as they are not needed or not used. The amount of times it was referenced in the book was very small, and the 8 spell schools were more thematic, but there was no clear through line through them, and it made it so it was hard to create new spell schools. So their thought was, what if the wizard schools are the curriculum of the world? So what they did is they took a lot of the existing school abilities and remixed the spells into them. The examples they gave were the School of Battle Magic. That would be where you'd find Fireball and Earthbind, Mist, Resist Energy, Falling Stars. The School of Civic Wizardry, that's where you build walls, summon constructs, run infrastructure. So things like Wall of Stone and Creation. Another one they highlighted, and the last one they highlighted that they liked very much was the School of Protean Form, basically biologic spells. So these would be things like Tanglevine and Spider Sting. But now they can add more spell schools, but they are tying them to the use rather than the type of spell. For this, they said Rune Lords was kind of the impetus. Rune Lord their example was, what if a Rune Lord went to the School of Sloth or the School of Wrath? By doing this, they can add flavor by not being limited to the type of spell being the school. Now, it might need some spot errata on some spells to fit the new concepts, but they also brought up one more, I'm sorry. They brought one more up at the end, which was the School of Unified Magic Theory, which is taking over the universe list. There is no particular curriculum for this, so you wouldn't actually go to school for this, but it does have additional feats and spells like the original universe list. But these are just feats for the School of the Unified Magical Theory. Should be easier, and wizards get simple weapons now. So one of the things they were very happy to talk about is you can now bring out that frying pan wizard with a wand in one hand and a frying pan in the other. Then we went into spells. Some of the things that they brought up were spell components being from the OGL, and it's a container for other traits. So they wanted to make spellcasting more individual to the caster and the information all in one place. So they removed some of the special substitution side cases and focused more on what spells look like when you cast and what it looks like for your character. So the change is in the reference. And the example they gave was it has somatic components, which means it also has manipulate. So why not just say it has manipulate? Fair number of the spells were named after the OGL, so they're renaming some of the spells, but they have the same mechanics, just a new name. There will be some rewriting needed for these functional replacements. They wanted to bring together some that were similar. For example, the example they gave was Glitter Dust and Fairy Fire are now just Revealing Light, as well as the light spell is now a combination of light and dancing lights. You can do both with the light spell. And then they want to do some remixes on the standards. One of the ones they brought up that was a high level spell was Falling Star. Now you can do things like if you pull a comet, you get ice damage. If you pull a meteor, it can break apart and cause sonic damage when it hits the ground. One interesting spell they brought up that apparently is new is Tree of Seasons. In this particular tree, we'll give you 4 seeds, and each one of the seeds is a different season. And by using that particular seed, you do a different type of damage, as well as Divine Land, which was a 2d4 spirit damage that can be sanctified, as we talked about when we were talking about clerics. They also talked about iconic spells that underperform but didn't scale well later. The one they brought up was Magic Weapon / Magic Fang, more of a name change, which is Runic Weapon or Runic Form on the Primal list. The Metal Anathema has been removed from the Druid, but some of these spells that they have been talking about, they might be lighter on the lower end, but they scale as they move up. They also want to talk about condition removal spells in Legacy. It was sometimes weak. So condition removing is now going to be a viable way to have a class, particularly if you want a cleric that is a specialist in condition removal. They do things like body agility and body toughness and mind toughness. And one of the things they talked about that if you come close to being able to overcome an illness or a condition with a particular spell, well, now you might be able to temporarily shut it down for a bit to prevent progression. They also teased about some of the changes to focus spells. What the change to the focus spells is when you refocus, you can get back a focus point, and it doesn't matter whether you used a focus point since the last time you refocused. It used to be that you had special feats that will let you get back 2 or 3. Well, now this one feat allows you to get back your entire pool just by spending the time to refocus for each particular point, not concerning whether you used a focus point in the interim. They also talked about cantrips. Pretty happy to talk about that. They're used a lot in your whole career. More of the legacy cantrips got a refresh. For example, now Frostbite cantrip puts an orb of ice around a person, and it gives them a weakness to bludgeoning damage on a critical success. So these kind of things give you a better tactical option because you can freeze a creature and then have the barbarian come along with a maul and do the bludgeoning damage and get a bonus to it because of it, as well as they just gave literally like a sentence worth of time to an ignition cantrip that lights people on fire. I don't know any more about it than you do, but it sounds super interesting. Because we were running out of time at this point, they mentioned crafting, and they literally said changes to make it easier. And they didn't specify anything else. From that point, we took a little 5-minute break, then got into GM Core. Now, the GM Core book, they wanted to make it a book that is all you need to run and build your games and bring it all into one book. So there's new navigational elements on the side of the page, different sections. The first section would be running the game, and then you get into building the game campaign and setting anything from that particular setting to monsters and traps. Then there'd be a section on Lost Omen settings, then subsystems, magical items, alchemical and treasures, relics, cursed items, stuff like that. They wanted this to be a one-stop shop for the GM, and there was a lot with subsystems. Some of the things they mentioned that were going to be changing in these subsystems is chases have changed. The math of chases made them a little bit more player-friendly in GM Core, and hoping for more participation from the entire party as opposed to having one or two people kind of doing everything. The research subsystem got some changes. They didn't necessarily make changes to the core with the research points, but it didn't give GMs the clearest guidance on how to encourage PCs in their research. So this gave advice on where to place the various checks and to guide them through the research, how to use it in exploration mode. Maybe a particular research type is going to be more physical or social. Maybe you have to defeat a series of monsters in order to go into this library in order to do a type of research, or maybe you need to convince a ghost that you have permission to enter the library. So there's more explanation on how you would do those kind of things, more guidance and more tools for the GM. Also a little bit about when you should and when you shouldn't use these particular subsystems. And then they also brought up the vehicles subsystems, put in more vehicles. So they brought in things from Lost Omens, Grand Bazaar, as well as other things like a hot air balloon. And then they're basically structured in a land, sea, and air restructure of all of these so things would be easier to find. Settings section talking about the planes specifically and how they're going to change the names to using more Galarian terms, Netherworld and other name changes to fit the Pathfinder setting. And these planes that were introduced in the Rage of Elements have been brought into GM Core, and they bring other setting sections up to date. So Player Core is still going to have a settings session, but it's going to be much smaller. But all these, including the regional descriptions, are going to be in full in the GM Core. A general tune-up of the areas and genres for the areas so that you know that if you are going to a particular region of the world, what to expect, what the general tenor of it's going to be. Also new things in the treasure section. Familiar stuff here, but there's new stuff as well. Wanted to clarify some things on magical item activation. It's condensed, so the traits are easier to read. Permanent items that have an activation trait, well, they're now named more to what they do. And it was especially important when a particular permanent item had multiple activations that it could do. They felt that talismans didn't pull their own weight. One of the ones they brought up was the Bronze Bull Pendant. In its current form, it's a free action. When you shove, you had to be trained in athletics, and a critical failure was a failure if you particularly use this Bronze Bull Pendant, and you had to use it before you roll. So you had to use the talisman before you knew you were going to fail. The new version, it's not a free action. It's a one action that you have to spend, but you increase the distance the shove does. It makes it easier to use and makes it easier for you to figure out when you're supposed to use it and hopefully encourage active use. They also wanted to take some of the talismans and get rid of some of the high level prerequisites that only gave you a bonus at things you were already good at. The one they specifically brought up for this was the Gallows Tooth. It lost its trigger and it lost the Intimidate requirement. And they also mentioned that potency crystals now scale up to major. And then one interesting talisman that they kind of brought up was the Alloy Orb. It basically will turn any weapon into a special material. So potentially if you need a silver weapon, it might be able to turn into that. Also brought up shields. They now have a shield rune that is a reinforcing rune that is etched on shields to improve durability and hardness. Sturdy shield is still the best for not breaking, but you can now include a reinforcing rune to other shields so they don't blow up at later levels. It gives shields flavor by using a shield that actually does something, but you can also use it to block as opposed to keeping it at your side the whole time. They brought up that there will be no property runes for shields coming up. They did add a full assistive items section. In the player core, there will be some simple things like wheelchairs and glasses and prosthetics, but there are advancements on the assistive items in the GM core that you can give to your players. They're foundational items in the player core that can be built upon by doing and looking at things in the GM core. Also talked about rebalancing poisons. Not too much information on it, just mentioned that there was one in specific that they could think of that needed it. And then changes to staves. In the past, schools of magic were imprinted on the staves. Well, since that's going away, now they're making changes. So like the staff of evocation is now being changed to the staff of elemental power with 3 different types. A lot of the same spells, but tighter in line with a new theme. Staff of the Dead can summon undead. Grim Tendrils, Vampiric Feast. Staff of Arcane. Now you can snap it and cause an arcane explosion, but it's a cone and it doesn't hurt you, the one who snapped the weapon. Also mentioned that the Walking Cauldron would be here, as well as the Crown of Witchcraft for witches. So there's specific stuff to the player core classes are now going to be in here. Then a very small section on Monster Core. It's the foundational monster book. It basically replaces Bestiary 1. There are a few swaps, depending on whether it came out in later bestiaries that probably should have been in Bestiary 1, as well as renaming due to the OGL. Talked about the new dragons. Not a whole bunch of new information. There's some new art, and I'll kind of put it up as we're talking through this, but it's still being designed. The look and theme of this particular dragons, as well as the book, will be coming out throughout the year as they get things together. You've already seen the early concepts of the Diabolic and the Mirage, but you can see here that there is the Lunar, the Aquatic, and a few others. Talked about an Adamantine dragon, foreshadowing it, but it's too early to see. And they want to talk about how the scale patterns kind of give you a sense of a deeper math as they were repeating patterns. With Fiends and Celestials, they basically had been relying on OGL monsters, so they wanted to go further back into folklore, into history, and see what existing demons and evils that they can use to fill a similar role. There are some that you've already seen, and there'll be a few new ones that they can't share yet. But they also want to talk about how the hierarchy is going to work. And also, they're taking imps out of the devil category and making it more of a general planar monster. So they'll be more unique, as well as more unique in their character stat blocks and what they are, but more widespread because they aren't just a demon. We also talked about hags. Hags are going back to the original source folklore material, basically tying themes together with the changelings now being in player core. They were saying they're now terrifying, and they kind of brought one up called the Sweet Hag. They use charm and spell effects to put into sweet treats and candy. So just like, the hags of old, they basically wanted to take all these monsters and see if it serves the folklore or if it has been dragged in from legacy, from OGL, and from the history of tabletop RPGs. And we just had a really small section on Player Core 2. The other 8 classes that are in the APG are Lost Omens plus Colo, that it was introduced with the Mwangi Expanse. Archetypes are going to be in here. Unless they were OGL, then they might be renamed. They did mention that 1 or 2 might be going away. But they mentioned in the old version with the player handbook and the advanced player's guide that you had basic things in the advanced player guide. They were just released later. Well, now Player Core is for the basics of players, and the Player Core 2 isn't necessarily about having advanced players. It just gives you more options. Now, I hope this little summary saved you a little bit of time. That was a full hour and 55 minutes. I have 5 pages of notes that I kind of went through here, and I hope it's much shorter than that. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell for more videos that come down the pipe. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.